This is Channel News Asia.
And welcome to SPEED, our much preferred acronym for a show called Singapore Property, Explained, Explored and Deconstructed. Doesn't leave much to the imagination, does it? Basically, if it's about property or even linked to property in spaces where we either work, play or live, SPEED has it covered. In this episode, we'll be seeking answers to our questions. How challenging and how much does it cost to turn an old conservation shophouse built in the early 20th century into a home for modern 21st century living? And is the result worth all that trouble? If, like me, you dream of living in a beautiful conservation home, you have to stay tuned to see that feature-length report. It has some really gorgeous homes. But first up is our Property Talk segment. SPEED recently sat down with a senior property agent and a mortgage broker to discuss the present conditions for first-time buyers.
In Singapore, the pressure for first-time property buyers is compounded by land scarcity, seductive private development advertising, and until recently, a stark imbalance between supply and demand for housing development board apartments. In response, the National Development Minister introduced several measures to make it easier for first-time buyers. But many still bemoan the present market conditions as being very difficult to get on the first rung of the property ladder. SPEED spoke to Eric Tan from Ornish Tea and Derek Ang from SingaporeHousingLoan.sg for their view of the market and some sound advice for first-time buyers.
Is this indeed the worst time ever for first-time buyers, or in your experience, has there been equally bad times?
Personally, I've experienced a few property boom cycle. I think in any upcycle, the property price tends to move ahead of the income. Now, fortunately, our government have introduced a scheme like for the HDB, Design, Build, Sell scheme, and the executive condo, ECs. And also recently, they have actually raised the income ceiling for both the DBSS to 10,000 and EC to 12,000. So some kind of ease off a bit of this sandwich class. I think it's in any boom, property boom, you will have this, traditionally you have this sandwich class buyers.
Is there a possibility that many first-time buyers these days are actually just rather unrealistic in their expectations about what they can buy?
During the property booms in 1990, it's okay for most of us to actually go on to a HDB first, to buy the first flat HDB, then go on to a private property after a few years. But perhaps at this moment, I think we are, number one, the population are more educated. Also, we actually come from a wealthier environment. So the tendency is most first-time buyer wants to own their first private property as soon as possible.
There is a lot of pressure from advertising, marketing, developers. But how big is the cost difference between going HDB and going private?
If you're talking about HDB, a 3-bedroom HDB currently, for example, in a good location, will cost about three to 400. But if you're talking about a condominium, 3-bedroom, in a good location, easily $1 million. So that's more than double in price.
And in terms of mortgage? I
mean, if you're talking about a mortgage for a $1 million home, you're talking about easily about $5,000 to $6,000 monthly installment.
Could it be argued, in fact, that the current low interest rates from banks mean that maybe it's not so difficult? I mean, you've got very low interest rates, so could it actually be a very good time to buy?
Low interest rate shouldn't be your deciding factor. All right. Potential rental income, capital gains, these are the factors people choose or not to buy a property. So I think low interest rate just makes it easier to take up a loan.
I think personally I've experienced 9.25% interest. I think at current moment is about 1.25% on average. So in fact, low interest rates should not be the main key factors for your consideration, because the only way is to go up rather than going down in terms of rates.
Now, the recent government cooling measures, was the government looking particularly at Singapore, or was it looking at Singapore in relation to, well, a more globalized outlook?
Perhaps the Singapore government have feared that the euro crisis may really happen and is contagious, and so they actually set these cooling measures to reduce the demand significantly, so that it actually soften the impact if the crisis were to hit us. Remember, measures can be lifted overnight. Crisis, you can't.
Could another factor affecting first-time buyers be what has happened in the West over the last few years? Is there a fear factor among buyers that what happened there could happen here?
The fear, I wouldn't say it exists, because I don't think the government or the banks will allow the property market to go into the subprime scenario.
I think the loan to value ratio is also key, because being the first property is 20% down payment, and for second property onwards is talking about 40% down payment. So technically, to hit you hard for the first property, the prices have to correct over 20% before the bank would do anything to the individual buyers.
If there was one seminal piece of advice that you could give to first-time buyers, what would it be? Derek?
I think it is prudent for a first-time buyer to secure an in-principle loan approval before deciding on buying a property.
So don't find the property, then talk to the bank.
Yes.
Talk to the bank, then go
and look for the property.
Eric, what would be the advice that you would give to?
I think firstly you do your own risk assessment. In the scenario whereby the interest rate were to go north, and in case you actually lost a job, okay, I think being prudent, you actually keep 6 months of installment, housing installment, mortgage installment in terms of cash, be it in cash or CPF. So do your sum, do your research, then go on to buy.
Derek, Eric, thank you very much for coming in to talk to us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It is the biggest purchase you're ever going to make, so I hope the advice of the Speed Studio guests can help all you first-time buyers out there. We're going to take a break, but stay